Welcome to Target 60. On this channel, we are going to test and review computer hardware by a metric you likely haven't seen before, playability. Now, it doesn't really matter if one can reach 200 FPS in a game. If the frame rates are jumping from 150 back to 200, down to 100, and then up to 170, and the whole thing averages to 165, it doesn't make for a good experience, and that's really what everyone is after, an enjoyable gaming experience. The testing methodology for playability is much harsher than what appears in most reviews, where the focus has been on average frame rates, and more recently the 1% and 0.1% lows. The latter of which are okay metrics, but that information is not actionable to most users. Even enthusiasts really don't know what to do with that information, hence the plethora of videos trying to explain it. And yet, there are still so many questions. On Target 60, it is our aim to provide viewers with actionable information when reporting on computer hardware. To reach that goal, our playability philosophy is defined as targeting a consistent experience across a suite of games such that the standard deviation of the frame rate and the frame times falls within a predetermined range, such that 90% or more of the frames viewed are consistent and, most importantly, above 60. This is a brutal test, but it is also quite an interesting one and should provide users with a better perspective when choosing which hardware to purchase or to keep using. Hardware scoring below 60 FPS won't be completely discounted, but there will be an increasing penalty at both 45 and 30 FPS levels, while anything below 30 will simply not receive a score. There will be a future video diving into this testing methodology, but with the basics over, let's see it in action and take a look at the Nvidia 1050 Ti, a very capable budget card, but just how playable is it? With 768 shader cores that can GPU boost up to 1800 MHz and 4GB of GDDR5 running at 7GB per second, it has some impressive statistics, but just how playable is it? We benchmarked the card across 5 popular titles, all at 1080p, across all the quality settings, to figure that out. Rocket League, one of my favorites, a game that will run on just about anything. The footage we're seeing now is the game at the high quality presets with no anti-aliasing and no motion blur, mostly because I don't like it. And we can see from the frame rate graph in the upper left corner that the frame rates vary anywhere from 100 to 160 FPS in this scene. Not bad, right? But interestingly, once we dive into the data, you can see that at the high quality and quality settings, the game is only 62 and 45% playable. Now many would say, well, look at the 149 and 185 FPS averages. How could that not be playable? And the challenge here is as I described earlier in the video. The frame rates are all over the place. You have lows of 100 with highs of 160. The standard deviation is 15.1 frames, and you're going to notice those frame rate changes as you're playing this game at these quality settings with this particular card. The lower settings, performance and high performance, do really well under the playability definition, but mostly because they are hitting the game's internal frame rate limiter of 250 FPS. Nonetheless, at these quality settings, they score 98 and 99% playable. Now, like you, if I bought a 1050 Ti, well, I did buy this one, I want to play Rocket League at high quality, but we just saw that it's not playable, or in other terms, it's not as enjoyable an experience as one would expect. So what can we do? Well, thanks to the magic of math and Riva Tuner, we'll dive into the math in another video. We can set a target frame rate that will maximize the playability of Rocket League at high quality with our 1050 Ti without forcing us to just set a minimum frame rate. Here we set a target of 120 frames per second and scored a 97% playability rating at high quality. With the quality setting, we achieved 160 frames per second and a 96% playability rating. Vast improvements, and from playing the games I can tell you, subjectively of course, that they were much more enjoyable. I even scored more goals. Probably a placebo effect, I'm sure. Now on to our next game, the 2016 release of Doom, which is running on the OpenGL API. Since Vulkan sucks on Nvidia, is seen here at the ultra quality preset and the frames are bouncing around quite a bit. 90, 60, a stutter, up to 170. It doesn't look promising for the playability test, that's for sure. Loading now on the screen, we can see the 1050 Ti scored an average frame rate across all quality settings of 86, but unfortunately a rather poor 77.5% average playability score. The standard deviations averaged around 10 frames. Not bad actually, but this game could be a lot more enjoyable with some Target 60 magic. That's better, but Doom just skirts by the less than 60 FPS penalty at the Ultra preset here with its 65 FPS target. Now with the frame rates targeted appropriately for each quality setting, we managed an average target FPS of 73. Not much lower than where we averaged prior to our targeted tweaking, and we gained on our playability score, averaging 99.6% playability. And this game was just awesome at ultra quality settings with consistent frame rates.
Maximum multiplier.
Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a game that is notoriously difficult to benchmark due to all the variability in the action. Even just running from spawn to the first bomb site sees a range between 190 and 280 FPS, a 90 FPS delta. This is a game where the argument for high frame rates is always fierce. Competitive players will tell you 300 FPS or bust, and the argument here is as much about low latency as it is consistency. At 300 frames per second, your computer is rendering one frame every 0.3 milliseconds, which is a lot. As a result, CSGO is a game that serves as a great example of the necessity of defining playability as a metric of consistency, not averages. If we dive into the data across all the tested quality settings, we see that the standard deviation of frames is 30. That's just stupid, and it shows in the highs and lows of the data as we watched the footage earlier. If you've ever said to yourself, I hate playing this game, as I did many times recording this footage, the inconsistency between frames may be partly to blame as we see the playability scores of CSGO with the 1050 Ti are less than 30%. It is truly unbelievable and a failure by any standard that the playability metric for CSGO is so low. So let's apply the Target 60 methodology, define some target frame rates and see what it gets us. At high quality with anti-aliasing enabled, we set a target frame rate of 150 frames per second. And let's just take a moment to appreciate how consistent the graph is in the upper left-hand corner. I'm still terrible at this game, and I believe I repeated how much I hate it even at these frame rates, but at least it was more consistent this time around. So now let's look at the data. Thanks to some frame rate targets we derived from our data logs along with some analysis, we achieved an average playability score for CSGO across all quality presets of 96% with our 1050 Ti. Much improved, and as we test more hardware in the future, this will serve as a good benchmark for comparisons. Overwatch is a game that is very well optimized to deliver both high and consistent frame rates. The footage we are seeing now is from the 1050 Ti on our Ryzen test system at the epic quality preset, and isn't it just glorious? If we watch the frame rate graph in the upper left hand corner, we can also observe that the frame rate without any tweaking so far is really consistent. And loading up the data shows that at the epic preset, Overwatch and the 1050 Ti managed a 90% playability score, our first passing mark without any additional configuration. Wow. We also see on the Ultra preset low frame rate deviations and an equally passing playability score, but after that the story starts to change and the other quality presets drop from 75 to 56 and 47% respectively. Somewhat disappointing after the strong showing at the Epic and Ultra presets, so let us load up the worst performer here. The low quality preset with a 47% playability score and see what we can do. We achieved a target frame rate of 160 on the low setting, and for those wondering, the minimum frame rate previously and observed again in our targeted data was 140. So the math is working, and we are both maximizing our frame rates while minimizing the deviations. Taking a look at the graph, we can see that we were able to achieve an average playability score of 99.3% after targeting the frame rates for each quality setting appropriately, a nice improvement from our earlier score of 71%. Grand Theft Auto 5 is the last game in our testing for today, and at the ultra quality settings shown here, the 1050 Ti did not fare well. The frame rates while driving through the city varied from the mid-30s to the high 40s, and that just doesn't work under the playability definition. We're not testing consoles here. Things got even worse once we saw some dense vegetation, with the frame rates falling into the teens. Even console players would find this unplayable. So let's take a closer look at the data and see where the 1050 Ti scored with GTA 5. At the ultra quality preset, the 1050 Ti scored only a 3% playability score, our lowest yet, and a 22 frame deviation. Ouch. These scores are so low we will most likely not realize a playable target frame rate. Moving on to the very high quality setting, the 1050 Ti did much better, averaging 82 frames per second with a 10.2 frame deviation and a 77% playability score. One interesting observation with the other quality settings, at the normal quality presets, the game stuttered quite a bit. No explanation, I'm afraid, but we had sudden frame jumps between 185 and 140 frames per second with noticeable jitters while running through the game. Here we are pulling up the targeted footage for the very high quality settings, as the ultra settings were simply unplayable. Diving into the data, we can see that at ultra with a minimum allowed 30 FPS target frame rate, the dips into the teens continued to make this quality setting unplayable, and the game scores 5% playability, not much of an improvement. I mean, even consoles aim to do better than this. The very high quality preset managed a 65 frame rate target with a playability score of 95%. There are some dips into the 50s in the dense grass areas, but overall this was much more playable compared to Ultra. I do have to say though that if you were running a CPU any less than the Ryzen 1800X in our test system, I would not recommend using this quality setting because you are very likely to fall below the 60 frame rate target, as this game can be very CPU intensive at times. You're much better off using the high quality settings on a lower tier CPU.
So where do we summarize things with the 1050 Ti today? Well, overall it did really well, reaching an average playability score of 92% at 113 frames per second. As we benchmark more hardware, we'll be able to fill out this chart and provide viewers with a stronger perspective of how combinations of hardware rank against each other. This video was longer than I expected, but it served to introduce playability, and I hope you will consider subscribing to the channel as we benchmark additional hardware under this metric. Cheers, and stay tuned for the Intel i7 7700K comparison coming soon.